Our guest speaker is Ian Kirkpatrick, who's the MD and founder of, I'm going to go pronouncing this. I should have checked this before. I'm going to say EISOP Limited.
Correct. Well done. Yeah.
Thank you. With over 30 years of experience working with boards driving performance across supply chain logistics, property, facilities, and HR. Now, I first came across Ian when I heard him respond wisely, authoritatively, and gently during a Q&A at a webinar. His extensive bio explains why he's been successful, and I take one aspect as, if you like, the magic sauce that Ian is renowned for, which is quickly identifying what others miss, the hidden operational and behavioural risks that sit behind underperformance. He's direct, as we'll find out, commercially grounded and focused on execution, ensuring that strategy translates into actions and results are delivered, not just planned. So I'm delighted that the Thrive ecosystem has the opportunity to hear from him. So my job was to simply get the right audience. Tick, here you are. Thank you very much for attending. Although in truth, Ella, who is monitoring the Q&A, did the real work in getting people here. My job will be to hand over to Ian in a minute to moderate the Q&A session at the end and close the session off. Now, we will have questions at the end. Please do put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat, but I'm sure Ella will move them to the right place anyway. She'll be monitoring both. Confirmation, you will get a copy of the slides. You will get a transcript. We're recording, as you're all aware. And Ian is also going to make a generous offer to you at the end of the session. If we end up with more questions than we can answer in the session, we will endeavour to answer all of those in the follow-up communications. So I think that's it in terms of preamble. I hope that's a clear introduction. Thank you for joining. And I'm delighted to hand over to Ian. And Ian will be nodding occasionally, and I will try and advance the slides when he does so. Thanks, Ian. Over to you.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for the introduction, Martin. And good afternoon, everybody. And I'm going to start by giving a bit of context to some of this and where it all came from. So in my corporate world, I took over as being from supply chain director to HR director for a global Japanese company. And one of the things close to my heart was the biggest asset, risk and cost to the business, which was people. And I started to understand some of the metrics under absence, attrition, so on and so forth, tribunals, so on and so forth. Realised there's quite a big sum of money here that wasn't really being looked at from a P&L perspective, because it wasn't a P&L. So I decided to dig further and found that we needed to understand our culture differently and look at our quality and so on and so forth. And I went to the CEO and said, I think we need to be doing some training on the Equality Act and risk associated. His response was quite clear. What's that going to do to sales? Well, okay, right, okay. So I went away and thought that was actually the attitude, and started to put some costs together of all the tribunals, all the absence, all the staff turnover, all the negativity and the surveys, etc., and came back with this is not about sales, but it is about improving productivity and improving profitability through treating our people in the right way. So in other words, here's the risk of doing nothing, here's the risk of getting it wrong, and I'll talk about managing human risk a lot. So clock forward a little bit, I was then in a meeting I'd gate crashed actually, which was about bridge strikes. So hence the driver element and trucks crashing into bridges, which happens on average 5 times a day. And there were quite a few representatives from big 3PLs and big businesses there, all particularly involved in compliance and dare I say, back in the day, if someone hit a bridge, then you better go and speak to HR because they obviously done something wrong there. But the conversation was more broad about well-being of the drivers, including facilities and truck stops and so on and so forth. So I had my operational head and HR head on, But one of the frustrations by the people in that meeting was that they weren't getting heard about well-being. And I said, well, I can help you there, because if you start monetarizing the cost of getting it wrong, then you might get a little bit more interest off the CEO and the CFO. And you start by saying, apart from it's the right thing to do, because eventually you want the whole premise to be, it is the right thing to do. And by the way, we can have a more productive business. So hence where this presentation came from in general. And one of the things that I kind of say, and this is where the direct element comes in, is that businesses need to stop treating well-being as a program and start treating it as a way of leading the business and a way of being in terms of a culture. So some of the statistics we've got in front of us is that 1 in 5 drivers struggle with mental health. With the onset of the pressure of technology and delivery success in logistics and completeness of order on time and full, there is a stress-related element in terms of driving jobs, and there's a double the risk of road collision, and all of this can lead to those areas there, and all of those can have a cost element. So absence and attrition is something that most businesses will manage. Insurance, is that associated in terms of the insurance claims, and therefore the risk of premium increase, is that looked at? And my view is that we have a lot of technology in cabs now. And by the way, this doesn't just have to reflect the drivers; it can be any driver or any industry. But for now, we're talking about HGV drivers and LCV drivers. A lot of technology, and I think there's a balance to be had in how much tech we put in a cab. In distraction, I know I drive some modern cars that beep at me a lot. I try and find a way of turning those off. Maybe that's just me, but it is about understanding that word again, the human risk. Martin, thank you. So kind of these numbers are a consequence, and the question here is to ask what hidden costs already are sitting in your business. And to the left there's a word, that meaningless. So these statistics are 51 billion, 300 billion pounds lost down to poor mental health in businesses, direct and indirect. And again, if you were to go to your CEO or CFO and say, did you know that we are part of losing 51 billion? So that means nothing to me, absolutely meaningless. So therefore, if you start breaking it down by employee, and this is Deloitte's average, saying that per employee, lost productivity costs around £1,800 per employee in 21 days. So we're getting now somewhere which is a little bit more close to home and more understandable. And then we have the impact on the fleet itself. I think every absence and collision tells a story, and great organizations kind of ask why before it becomes just another KPI. So these absences in terms of the driver could be 250, 350, could be 400. It all depends on what you put in terms of holiday and sickness cover, pension, NI, etc., into your cost per driver per day. But if it is that number, and you have 3 absences a week, then you're into a significant sum of money there. And then let's look at the minor collisions of 10 to 30k, and these are the insurance numbers that are coming up. The average vehicle repair and cost of third-party damages is soon ramping up. And then the injury side of it, and the fatality element there is on average 1.6 million. The reason there's an 8 million there is my own experience of we had a fatality where a motorcyclist was killed by one of our drivers, and the motorcyclist, the insurance reserve put against that accident was 1.6 million. up until the fact that we realised that the motorcyclists, and it was put on to us that the motorcyclist had a disabled 11-year-old son. So then the costs of the care came tumbling in on that, and then the reserve went up to 8 million, and this went on for years and years and years. We didn't settle for 8, but we settled for more than 1.6. And at that point, there's an insurance premium uplift naturally. But more importantly, this is where those noises started to come from, at the time, the head office in Tokyo on the risk of insurance globally. And I'll come on to that, because that was a significant accident that was a result of our driver not focusing, and subsequent investigation on that was he had some troubles. So the the human risk iceberg here is, what do we track? We track a lot of things. On a vehicle, we'll track collisions, we'll track fuel, we'll track vehicle damage, insurance claims. But one of the things that we don't actually understand necessarily or track, such as psychological trauma. One of the examples of psychological trauma was a driver who had actually witnessed a fatality. He was not involved in the accident, but had witnessed it. And over the coming weeks, months, wasn't right. His absence went on. He just wasn't okay. There was a kind of what is wrong? And eventually I sat down with him, and he had serious repercussions of the accident. So it ended up that he was diagnosed with PTSD, but sometime after the event, and this event had driven lack of sleep and so on and so forth. So he was very tired, wasn't up for his job, etc. There was no one, and we'll come on to this, no one at the time who could kind of recognise that. And being a big, tough guy, he was like, well, I'm fine, everything's okay. Well, actually, it wasn't okay. And once that recognition and that diagnosis was made, then it changed his life going forward for the better. I like this slide because it's very pictorial in terms of for every pound cost there on collisions we have, what we know are insured, the injuries, ill health and damage, and look at all those areas that are, sick pay, fines, overtime working, loss of business, all those areas that are not looked at. But one of the big questions that I've asked and continue to ask is, if there is a problem and a driver has either been involved or witnessed a major accident or has problems, and who to talk to. And you take an example of, a driver maybe come back and he's had a torrid time or witnessed something, and the first person he'll talk to is the driver debrief supervisor or someone like that. And he might ask, are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine. Okay, well, here are the keys, off you go for your next run. Or no, I'm not okay. Oh, well, you better go and talk to HR. And I know, because I've looked after HR departments and fleet and supply chain departments. Our HR qualified. Well, we've got a great employee assistance program. Here's the number. And if you think about that from the journey for that particular individual, I've witnessed something that was horrific. I've come back, I've asked them, okay, I've said I'm not okay. So I'm sent to another department that I'm not comfortable with. What have I done wrong? I'm going to HR. I know they can help as well. And then I'm given a number. So there's a gap there that, maybe the likes of Thrive can help in that training. I'll go on to that in a little bit. So yes, in terms of long-term accidents, some more statistics here. Mental health is a leading cause of long-term workplace absence. There's a big chunk in blue there, which is mental health and stress related. I never particularly like these charts that have other causes of minor illnesses. So the minor illnesses, as an example, are colds, stomach bugs, and headaches. And other causes would be something like dental pain and eye condition and digestive conditions. So And all of this leads potentially to attrition, which is a huge cost. And you've got the reduction in productivity, you've got customer service potentially let down, you've got all the onboarding and training, recruitment costs, and somewhere between 7,000 and 15,000 per driver, which is fleet using CIPD. But it's also how you look at it from a cultural perspective. And last year I was talking to a large 3PL and about their staff turnover and driver turnover was at 37%. And, I would argue that's pretty high. I'd say standard of 25% is probably where it would be normally. The response I got off the representative from that business said, well, that's the industry. It's like, well, if you got 37% staff turnover, and this business had around 2,000 drivers, so that's a hell of a cost. You might want to be looking at some of the reasons, or looking deeper at some of the reasons into the analytics of why these drivers are leaving at using the tools available, such as actually quite funny because we used to put in when people left, we would do a leavers interview, and one of the questions I asked in corporate land was, well, why do people stay? So let's ask that question. Maybe there are some good things that here that maybe there's stuff we're missing, but let's understand our people, understand what's driving them to leave. And brand reputation risk. Your vehicle is a moving billboard, and this is an actual. This time last year, roughly, this happened. This vehicle went into a lake. And I was actually doing some supply chain transformation with this business at the time. And when I walked into a particular distribution centre, the general manager came up to me and said, oh, you probably heard it was on national news. But no, I haven't. He said, oh, we put a truck in a lake at the weekend. All right, okay. How's the driver? It was a question I asked. He's fine, back at work. Not the question, how is the driver? He said, yeah, no, we did. Well, yeah, it's okay. But anyway, it blown my delivery success for the day. But I'm okay. They walked away from that. And the business actually put a press statement out, which was, our drivers are skilled and trained to deal with such circumstances. And I did actually say, I haven't seen Tom Cruise knock it around, but you've got us in a truck at 45 degrees in a lake. It's got to be a Mission Impossible run. And joking aside, I couldn't let this lie, so we went and had a look at the driver's history, and it was on a warning. Just a written warning. Last 12 months, he'd had a couple of minor incidents and then a bit of absence. Then this. I said, okay, so how long has this driver been with the business? For 11 years. Okay. Well, what was his record like before this? Fine, up until this year. Maybe we'll have a conversation about what's not quite right then.
I'll click that on just a reminder, everybody, if you've got any questions that come up, please put them in the Q&A.
And for me, it's this is my observations generally. Some of it is pretty. Have a look in your own businesses really, in terms of where is the responsibility. In HR, look after well-being, fleet, possibly safety, finance, with insurance, and incident management under operation. So is there then a single team in terms of the ownership? Because the human risk crosses, HR, fleet, finance, operations. So if everyone owns part of it, who kind of owns the whole? And where should it sit? And this is where I think it should come on to what I've done in a minute. But one of the businesses I work for, Japanese business, global business with many subsidiaries, and we were one, but we also had an insurance company, so we had no choice in who we insured through. and therefore the clarity of all the reporting was at board level across subsidiaries. So there was an element of we had to have then a framework which looked at someone from fleet, someone from HR, someone for insurance and operations, etc. But for me, I kind of went a bit deeper than that, because the human risk should really be managed by every other strategic risk in my views, and not just be an initiative on its own, but a way of being. Which led on to what I call the radical collaborative model. So this is actually what I did. A fleet around about 2,000 vehicles, including company cars. And I'll talk separately about company cars, but we drove, excuse the pun, these weekly cross-departmental risk reviews involving everyone. And there was a particular meeting we were sat there because it was predominantly down to operations in such as you had your warehouse and your fleet, HR representative there, and I was looking at the accident claims, and there was a £300,000 claim from a sales office. So I said, well, you need someone from sales here. Let's get the sales representative in. And we don't do that. So I'll leave it with me. So I went and got one of the sales directors and said, I need you to sit in on our weekly insurance reviews. Surprise, surprise. Apologies to any salespeople on the call. What does that do for my sales? So it doesn't do anything, but how many widgets do you need to sell to cover 300 grand's worth of insurance claim? Maybe one of you, what? I said, yeah, that happened because literally someone hung their coat on a coat stand and it fell on their head. And now we're in your telesales office, so please come along and let's get marketing involved. Why do we need marketing involved? Because we want to do some internal comms on what good looks like on risk and human risk and reporting and making sure that people are safe and so on and so forth and are able to come forward. And that data was shared at each monthly exec. So from the CEO, the CFO, it became a early identification for stress levels. We put in training of what is now sort of mental health first aid. It wasn't called that when we were doing it, but it was all about the prevention rather than the risk. And with company car drivers, when we started to look at how we assess the drivers themselves, company cars hadn't been touched. Company car, because they're great drivers. I used to be a company car driver. In actual fact, they were probably one of the biggest risks. And what we had and a huge amount of claims comes from company cars, largely down to, I've scuffed my car and I want it to look perfect, so I'll get it fixed and I'll put it through the company insurance. So the direct approach was, okay, you can do that. Over 500 quid, anything up to 500 quid, you pay yourself. Guess what? Claims went down dramatically. And more importantly, people started to drive a bit more carefully. So if you look at, if you do all of this slide, what are the questions to ask yourself? We track vehicles, we track fuel, we track utilization and compliance and so on and so forth. But do we actually look at the mental condition of the person driving the vehicle? And a question that when I did this last time was slightly emotive is, should well-being issues be risk assessed like any other workplace hazard, which would need a shift in policy and appraisal? And I don't necessarily mean that in terms of a bad thing. This is something I implemented where we had a driver assessment every 20 or 50,000 miles, depending on the vehicle, and was covered so roughly once a year. And that would include an eye test and so on and so forth. And we came across, there was a business development manager, as an example, who had glaucoma, didn't know it, couldn't read a number plate. So that was an early warning, an early spot for a company car driver, and because we were part of a global business, we actually had a call to action, which was all subsidiaries globally had to submit to Tokyo our risk assessments and vehicle checks and driver human risk, etc., etc. And a lot of the subsidiaries may have been, as an example, 4 or 5 people in a head office in Vietnam or somewhere like that. But because we had such a huge fleet, in theory, we should have been ahead of the game, and we were, to the point that our systems were taken globally. But where this actually came from, interestingly, was the call to action was as a result of a Japanese graduate in Tokyo who'd taken a company car out and crashed, but crashed not in any way in a serious way, but enough to cause some angst amongst the head office people. Therefore, global call to action. But it meant that everything we were doing, with the human risk element of it, looked firmly at the well-being, etc. So finally, thanks for listening. And I suppose the challenge going forward is how to make human risk part of how you lead, and how those decisions can create performance. So the ideal here is to get back to the thing about it's the right thing to do. There is a cost associated, but it is the right thing to do. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian. I'm sure there'll be some questions appearing in a minute. I think there's one appeared at the moment, but if I may, I'm going to jump in, because you very articulately and passionately make a case that is a no-brainer once all the evidence is laid out. And I often wonder to myself whether salespeople understand the difference between profit and sales, because you have cleverly pointed out, and I have this in discussing in retail, where they've got wafer-thin margins. It's actually a huge amount of money if you're losing that 300k off your bottom line in terms of how much you've got to sell above that. So that came across particularly powerfully for me. But how do you actually get, in your experience, can you guide us as to what the best way to get the CFO's attention is in order to be able to state your case and open the door to lay that out? Because in my experience, quite often with the CFO, when you lay something out, they get it, but you can't always get through their door or their inbox or whatever else there is in terms of barriers. So I don't know if you've got any tips for that.
Yeah, I suppose it depends on where you sit in the organisation. But if you're a frontline manager, as an example, then that is looking at the customer service element, the things that are right in front of you, looking at the customer service, looking at the absence. You'll know that on a day-to-day basis. You'll know lateness. You'll know that sort of basic stuff, and that can then be form part of a conversation with your next manager up is, did you know we've got this problem here? We do measure these tools, etc. So it's building that picture. It's a bit like even though I was sitting on the board, I had to go away and find a very different route to the CEO when it came to what did I do for sales. So it's very much about a collaborative approach within a department to begin with, that can demonstrate some of these really basic areas where there will be a cost. And now that frontline manager may not know what the cost is, but he might say, look, we failed on our delivery service because our driver was either in an accident or he was late and he's continued to be late, and let's sit down and have that conversation. So it's building that picture.
Thank you. So definitely a question of building a picture. Question here from Amy. Thank you, Amy. The question, Ian, is drivers often spend the majority of their time on the road rather than with their managers. How do you suggest we maximise communications on these important topics with this population with limited face-to-face time?
Having a really effective debrief. So I wouldn't be doing it in cab, because there's too many times that I've had to pull telesales people or whatever off because they're always hounding the people when you're at the next drop, so on and so forth. But if you have a really effective debrief that talks about how your environment, how was your environment today, how was your run today, what troubles did you have, almost like a tick box sort of thing of anything more you want to be telling me. So you've got to get a driver to open up. That's the first thing, because you're right. They're on there they're on the road for a reason. Discussion about drivers because they want to be away and they want to be their own boss for a certain period of time. So there's in particular trampers, which are the guys who spend 4 or 5 days away. So if you have a really effective debrief that asks all the right questions, including, I'm steering away from the kind of well-being word, because it's more about risk. So you could ask the driver's example, were there any risks that you saw today? What happened? Is there anything that actually happened to put you off your driving today? There's those kind of languages we're not asking about your weaknesses, we're just asking what happened on the road today, what happened. The other thing I've done in the past is a day in a life with the driver. The HR team we had retail and warehousing and distribution. So I would make sure that to understand the business from an HR perspective, let's get out and go on a day with a delivery driver, go into a branch and witness what they have to do to understand. So when that call comes, there's a collaborative understanding of the type of pressures that drivers are under.
I think the relatability of that is it's clear, and just throwing in a Thrive perspective on that, we don't particularly have transport and logistics as a vertical we concentrate on. We'd like to, hence inviting you here into this audience. But we do deal with a number of industries, particularly things like utilities, where they have a lot of people remotely on the road in vehicles. And I can only echo that in terms of typical, and obviously this is a gross generalization, but in dealing with that population, the word well-being can have connotations that mean that people start to switch off. So your little tip there of perhaps not using that word is something that we find is very helpful with that group of people. The other thing that we've done effectively is still have tax disc stickers in the windscreen, even though there's no tax discs in many cases anymore. And on the back of that, we put the QR code to download Thrive. And it's the simplest of things, but if people do that, again, we can have a line of communication, which doesn't mean now actually necessary having to talk to the manager. And that, again, can open up a dialogue that perhaps otherwise might not happen. But certainly your tip along around the W word is something that may not work for everybody, but it's something that resonates with us dealing with high-risk remote populations of people that are kind of mobile. Next question is from Fiona. Thank you, Fiona. Are there examples, Ian, of organisations identifying early signs of driver stress or fatigue? And if so, how did they address around privacy or surveillance?
There are a few that are involved in kind of research programs. So this is where I was talking about that gap. So the gap of how do you identify whether a driver is stressed or under duress or whatever. It's certainly not the job, or currently isn't the job of the driver debrief supervisor or even some of the HR people. So there's an education process. So there are 2 or 3 3PLs I know that are scratching the surface on this. the whole reason behind this, by the way, is to get the company to start listening more so. There's some research being done by Loughborough University and NHS Diabetes Centre on the different side of wellbeing, and they themselves are struggling at a point that says, well, wellbeing, okay, that's nice kind of thing, rather than this is definitely something else. There are a couple or 3PLs that are currently putting it as part of their CPC, so their driver competency program. They're very few and far between, literally 3 I know of. But that's the way forward, is to have, and I can help in terms of introductions, etc. Part of your CPC training is wellbeing awareness, and particularly from not just the frontline manager, if you like, or the HR individual, the driver itself, to recognise there's something ain't quite right. You go back to that PTSD thing, example, where it took kind of time for that person to realise, I need to go and get this sorted out. And that's the thing that tipped him over the edge, if you like, was he dropped his daughter off at university and she went to hug him and he stood away. And that was the time he said, I need to go and train this. So few and far between, but there are some that I can help.
Thanks, Ian. Those of you who regularly listen to these webinars for the Thrive ecosystem will know I'm not given to plugging Thrive, but I'm going to do a little plug for a moment because it does relate to the answer to this question. We do have other sessions where we do promote it, but I generally choose to moderate the ones where we have guest speakers and we don't generally talk about Thrive. But we encourage people to have an anonymous daily checkup in the app. And it is something we can get drivers in the habit of doing, and that is absolutely about identifying an early sign. And in fact, us intervening in real time anonymously to those drivers if there is an issue. So it is part of what we are able to facilitate in conjunction with obviously the right environment in the workplace, and that tends to trump everything. But it is another method, and it works alongside the formal methods.
I think it's a good shout, Martin. I think one of the things to focus on is if you're considering, as I said, a robust debrief is very carefully how you work the questions. I've seen surveys that go on an app to go anonymously to drivers in research. One of the questions is straight out of the NHS which is, have you had any suicidal thoughts recently?
Well, so funny you said that. I was contemplating saying that. So again, the community that I was talking about just now, which is remote drivers, in particular, we're able to identify PHQ-9, which is suicidal ideation, and there is we discovered an enormous spike in it in particular hours in the day, and we will always get different answers. And it's interesting to look at the different answers you get through an anonymous program versus what's coming back through your MHFAs and to managers where you're actually engaging the resources of the organisation, because you know somebody's got a problem, but the people that you don't know have a problem, for those are where the greatest risk can be. So if we can help identify those and help give you suicidal ideation times of the day when it's happening, then most organisations can then go back and understand what's going on at that time of the day. We have one example, which I don't want to de-anonymise the customer, okay, but it'd be obvious if I talked about it actually, but they can absolutely see exactly why that's happening, because it's all provided in the anonymised MI that we're able to give back. So you make a great point again there, Ian. So thank you. Question for you from me, in the absence of any more. Please feel free to put more in the Q&A. You said human risk should be treated like any other safety system. So I'm going to be obliged to ask you an obvious and difficult question, which is, in your experience, how often is human risk treated like any other safety system? And I know particularly you operate at a board level, so, and how does it work?
So you'll have human risk in terms of safe systems of work. So, if you're driving a forklift truck or driving a vehicle, you will be assessed and so on and so forth. So that kind of is skills based. humorous. So if you then go on to the piece that we're talking about, it not often is it until something goes wrong. You know, what happened there. So there's a little bit of a preempt there is what could go wrong. And my experience is that it's quite tough, because you need to first have the right data and understand the data and be looking under the right bonnet, if you like, to spot the trends. So you can start with your people analytics side of it and really drill into that area. Recently, as I got some analytics off 3PL, and it was just how many people had left the depot. That was as far as depots across the UK. That's as far as it went. So I don't know. Maybe you want to know why, and so on and so forth. So again, it's one of those. What does it do to productivity? This whole thing that we're talking about here is how you can improve your productivity, reduce your costs without doing anything other than understanding your employee engagement better and your value proposition for your people better. You need to be asking the questions first, and they're difficult questions, though people shy away from difficult conversations, right? Though for me, it's not enough would be the answer in my experience, and you know, trying to change it is where do you join up all this great work, all this fractional work that's going to, you know, you've got yourself, as an example, Thrive. There's something called EISOP. There's Shift. There's a lady who does. I think she's Lady in My Tramper. She does Radio 1 FM, HGV, looking at facilities. There's all this great work going on, but it has to have a shift, and that's why I'm interested in talking to kind of the NHS, because as soon as I saw that badge and speak to them, they're saying, well, it's obvious we want to lessen the burden on the NHS. So the more people who can start to understand how it improves people's lives as well as business, the better. But the difficult, I'll ask you, well, where are you going to get that conversation? How are you going to get that conversation going at the right level? And that's where it comes full circle to proving that it's going to cost a lot of money, I'm afraid, rather than it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I recognise that was a tough old question, so thank you for handling that one. But you touch on there, Charming Mayfield's Keep Britain Working report, which is very much about, you know, needing to work alongside the NHS, and what a great resource employers are, because they've got reach to 35 million people in terms of the prevention aspect, way before the NHS, which many would argue is a national sickness service rather than a health service. So there's a great opportunity if we can get these things to work, to act as a prevention and an early detection mechanism. So I think we're all on track for that.
So the other thing I'll add to that is, if you're a business if you take the HGV shortage in the UK at the moment, it's around 60,000. Okay, so it's dramatically down from where it was after COVID. But only 4 or 5% are under the age of 25, and similarly 4 or 5% are females. So we've got a big gap, and if you're doing the right thing via your employees and saying we care and we'll look after you and so on and so forth, you might just be getting your employment gaps filled quicker. B, also your brand. It's a much bigger logistics thing in my head in getting logistics to be a better recognised brand for what it is. You can do that through employees saying what a great place to work and how well we're looked after.
Absolutely right. Okay, I'm going to move towards wrapping up now, if that's okay. I don't think we've got any outstanding questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to mention your kind offer in a minute. Before I do that, just for those of you who are interested, the next webinar in the Thrive session is this one up here, and if you look at the website, you can see a series of of webinars that we have. We would hope to have Ian back again in the future to do a webinar as well. I think there's lots of topics to be covered in transport and logistics, as we established when we were figuring out exactly what the title was going to be for today, which was extremely focused and very valuable on that basis. So thank you. Apart from my earlier plug, this is the only other time I was going to mention Thrive. So this will be in the deck that you get. In terms of the app is the digital on-ramp to the whole service, which is triage and therapy as well. But if you want to talk to us about that, then please do. These are Ian's contact details. You'll be getting all of that information in the follow-up, and also an invitation. If today's discussion has made you in any way curious about your own hidden performance gap, which is one of Ian's little rubrics, what it might be costing your organisation, then Ian is kindly offering a complimentary executive performance conversation. So if you mention Thrive, or indeed mention use the details from the follow-up deck, I would imagine that's not entirely open-ended. I probably can't necessarily use that in 2 or 3 years. Maybe you can, Ian, I don't know. But either way, thank you for offering that out to everybody that's attended to today, and anybody else that gets the slides, regardless of that. We really appreciate that. And what is clear from today is the credibility and the experience and the value that you can bring to any organisation. So I would very much like to thank you for coming and sharing your expertise so passionately and articulately with us. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to everybody that has attended. Thank you to Ella for doing the Thrive work in the background to make sure that everybody was here, all the tech worked, and she'll be making sure you all get the follow-up details. So thanks very much again, and goodbye. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again, Ian.
Thanks, Martin.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.